It's April 17th, 1525, Easter Monday, in the German town of Vinesburg. But rather than celebrating the holiday, Margareta, Countess of Heffelstein, is begging for her husband's life. Kneeling on the muddy ground, she wails and moans, pleading for mercy from the man standing over her. But this man is Jacqueline Rohrbach. He's one of the leaders of the great peasants' revolt, and he's, frankly, unmoved by the tears of a noble woman. As Jacqueline's signal, a fifer begins to play. It's a jaunty tune, a last dance for the men condemned to die today. The peasant rebels form themselves into two lines, creating a channel a metre or two wide. It looks like a little guard of honour, like a salute to the once proud nobles who must pass between. But in fact, it's nothing like that. Both sides of the channel bristle with spears and pikes, their sharpened tips ready to tear noble flesh. Beside Vinesburg's lower gate, the Count and 6 others are pressed towards the mouth of the channel. They hesitate, but the force at their backs is too strong. They plunge forwards, delving into the forest of spears. The fifer plays louder and faster, a jolly accompaniment, the skewering of flesh and muscle as the men are punctured and pierced. Countess Margareta is now beside herself. She shrieks and beats the ground with her fists. She's still shrieking when the last of the noblemen falls to the floor, bleeding out into the dust from the hundreds of wounds that riddle his body. The unfortunate noblemen have met with the Speergesser, or the pike alley, a form of running the gauntlet. None survived. Now, I know what you're thinking. Running the gauntlet is not typically viewed as a form of execution. It's painful, it's humiliating, but it's not usually supposed to be lethal. And yet, the tale of Helfenstein and the bloody Easter of Vinesburg shows us that it can be lethal and that in some situations the killing was intentional. This is a world away from Royal Navy officers meting out discipline on their ships, or from frat houses at American universities hazing new pledges with cruel and unusual methods. So this leaves us with an important question. Just what was this practice of running the gauntlet really about? Is it a corporal punishment, a method of causing non-fatal injury to teach someone a lesson? Or is it a capital punishment, a way of giving a whole body of men the chance to revenge a wrongdoer? Or is it a rite of passage, a trial? Could it even be a way for a victim to pay for their sins and wipe the slate clean? Or is it all of the above? To find out, we need to go right back to the beginning. Humans have been finding new and innovative ways to harm one another since the dawn of time, but the first records of something resembling a gauntlet come from ancient Greece and ancient Rome. The Greek zelakapia and the Roman fustorium are essentially the same thing. They both mean beating with clubs, and they were used to inflict punishment and instill discipline within military formations. The historian Polybius describes how fustarium would have worked in the Roman army. The tribune takes a cudgel and just touches the condemned man with it, after which all in the camp beat or stone him, in most cases dispatching him in the camp itself. But even those who manage to escape are not saved thereby, for they are not allowed to return to their homes, and none of the family would dare to receive such a man in his house. We can see the roots of the gauntlet in Polybius' description of fustarium. The victim is othered, he's set apart from his former comrades, and he's taught a lesson. And the men doling out the punishment are taught lessons too. They learn that it's better to be with your comrades punishing someone else than against them receiving the punishment yourself. But fustarium is missing one key element of the gauntlet. Its structure. The word gauntlet comes from the Swedish word gatlopp. Literally, this is a combination of gata, meaning lane, and lupa, to run. So a true gauntlet needs to take the collective shaming aspect of Fustarium and apply this structure to it. By the early modern period, that's exactly what we see in the historical record. From the 16th century onwards, the armies of the Holy Roman Emperor would use Digasa, or the alleyway. The victim would be stripped to their waist and forced to walk between two rows of their comrades. Armed with cudgels, switches, or even sharpened spears and pikes, these comrades would strike out at the victim, bludgeoning or cutting his flesh. The 16th century Swiss-German artist Jost Amann captured the practice in action. This was the Speersgasse. It was essentially a large number of men on each side of a channel, armed with sharp pikes and a hapless victim in the middle. This certainly feels more like a gauntlet, but what was it supposed to achieve? Was it supposed to injure the victim and chasten them into living more honourably, or was it actually supposed to kill them? Well, it seems this depended on the context. Records show that some victims of the Dirgasse would be led through the gauntlet by another soldier. The soldier carried a knife and ensured the victim kept to a walking pace. There was no running allowed in this gauntlet. This might seem quite harsh on an already defenceless victim, but it does suggest something important. It suggests that this form of Dirgasse was not meant to be lethal, because if it was, the victim would probably just take his chances with the knifeman and hope it would be over quickly. Instead, the victim was encouraged to just roll with the blows and hopefully come out the other side in one piece. In other cases, however, it definitely was lethal and death was basically the whole point. The Landsknecht were German mercenaries who made up the core of the Holy Roman Empire forces for much of the early modern period. They wielded sharp pikes and long arquebus shotguns, and so they were a formidable force, but their power on the battlefield had to be backed up with staunch discipline. If a soldier brought dishonour to their Landsknecht unit, they would face the Recht der langen Spieße, or the right of the long spears. This was essentially a court-martial in which the accused could plead his case, and if he failed, he would run the gauntlet and would not come out the other side. An alley would be formed between two banks of men, 3 deep, and each man bore a pike. The accused would run east to west through this alley, apologising to his comrades or begging their forgiveness. Or, more likely, just screaming as he was stabbed repeatedly. If a pike bearer allowed the victim to slip out of the alley and escape, then he would be the next to run the gauntlet. While this was going on, the unit's colours would be thrust upside down into the ground as a symbol of their dishonour. Only by successfully meting out this punishment could the regiment's honour be restored. It was this Landsknecht practice that inspired the peasant rebels in Vinesburg in April 1525. After seizing the town, the rebels condemned 7 noblemen to death, including Count Ludwig of Heffelstein. And to be honest, Heffelstein was a tyrant who probably deserved what he got. As the historian Ward Durant notes, many of the peasants were very specific in their criticisms of him. "You thrust my brother into a dungeon," one cried, "because he did not bare his head as you passed by. You harnessed us like oxen to the yoke," shouted others. "You caused the hands of my father to be cut off because he killed a hare on his own field." Rather than behead the nobles or use some other honourable form of punishment, they decided to punish them the Landsknecht way, with the gauntlet. This was designed to be a symbolic method that robbed them of their lofty status in society, and it worked. Or at least, in Vinesburg, it worked. Elsewhere, the rebels were not quite so successful. Rather than bring about massive social change, they brought about a bloody retribution instead. Around 300,000 rebels were believed to have taken part in the uprisings of 1524 and 1525, and more than a third of those were killed in what turned out to be a very one-sided affair. At Frankenhausen the following month, more than 7,000 rebels were killed out of a force that probably numbered only 8,000 to start with. The aristocracy forces, in contrast, lost just 6 men. Not 6,000. 6. The rebels had their fun with the gauntlet at Vinesburg, but ultimately it achieved nothing except making Countess Heffelstein muddy her dress. Rohrbach himself would be burned alive as punishment, and he probably ended up thinking Heffelstein had gotten off easy. So, using the gauntlet to intentionally kill didn't end well for the peasant rebels, and as the reputation of the Landsknecht declined in the 16th century, the practice of gauntleting as a capital punishment became increasingly rare. Over the following centuries, the practice was retained as punishment for soldiers and sailors, but with strict rules in place. These rules would prevent a corporal punishment from becoming a capital one. Often, edged weapons were banned, so the victim couldn't be stabbed or slashed. At other times, soldiers participating as part of a gauntlet were not permitted to move from a designated spot. The victim may also be allowed to protect themselves by raising their hands, resulting in fewer blows to the head. In the Prussian cavalry, the gauntlet was applied using stirrup straps, rather than rigid rods or clubs. This would cause real pain, but it wouldn't break any bones. The British Navy used whips and flails, similar to a cat and nine tails. In some cases, the victim might be given the cat before they were unleashed into the gauntlet. The strikes of their comrades would compound the agony and the humiliation they'd already suffered. Again, this would be pretty awful, but it wasn't likely to kill. However, while all of this was going on in Europe, it seems the forms of gauntlet running were developing independently across the Atlantic. These methods also weren't designed to kill, but they were certainly designed to humiliate, terrorize, and injure. The Jesuit missionary Isaac Jogues described what happened when he was captured by a party of Mohawk Iroquois near Quebec City in 1642. We were marched past the young men of the country in a line, armed with sticks. We were made to walk slowly for the sake of giving time to anyone who struck us. This seems quite similar to the European gauntlet, but it seems Jogues was singled out for special treatment. Before he'd even arrived at the gauntlet, Jogues apparently had the nails torn out of his fingertips. Bizarrely, his captors then bit the bleeding ends of his fingers until the bones were visible. After the gauntlet treatment, he then had his thumb chopped off and was tied spread eagle in a cabin whilst children dropped burning hot coals onto his body. Following this, they were then marched to another village and then a third, where they met with more gauntlets. Finally, Jogues' torment was ended when an Iroquois in the third village took pity on him. Jogues leaves us with a detailed account of his treatment, but we do need to be a little careful when we approach this kind of story. Isaac Jogues was hailed as a living martyr on his return to France and would eventually become a saint. So his story has become part of Catholic hagiography, which means it can be difficult to separate truth from legend. However, Pope Urban VIII did make a special dispensation for Jogues. He was allowed to hold the Eucharist between two fingers, rather than between the finger and thumb, which is usually required when saying Mass. So it seems, at the very least, Jogues did lose his thumb. Other Native American peoples also used similar practices. When Shawnee and Lenape warriors entered the settlement of Great Cove, Pennsylvania in 1755, they weren't there on the business of peace. Instead, they killed between 7 and 32 people and took several prisoners. One of these prisoners was Charles Stewart, who was forced to run a gauntlet into the Lenape settlement, passing between around 100 Lenape on each side. In his own words, they were armed with various kinds of weapons such as axes, tomahawks, cutlasses, hoop poles, pieces of wood, etc. But they did not strike with the axes and only used the heads and handles of their tomahawks. They used the blades of the cutlasses, though not with so much severity as to kill. It's clear that they weren't out to murder Stewart and the other prisoners, although it seems that the wounds they received were pretty severe. Stewart remembered, "I received a blow to the side of my forehead with one of them, which cut me to the bone." Meanwhile, back in Europe, running the gauntlet was being softened and sanitized by the late 18th century. This was because running the gauntlet wasn't really working as an out-and-out punishment. It was just too chaotic and a bit too cruel. For commanders eager to keep order, it was better to reframe the punishment. The gauntlet became an opportunity for the condemned to pay for their crimes through an ordeal, rather than simply a way to inflict pain and suffering. But over time, Even this became a problem. In some instances, the victims' comrades would simply refuse to take part, and this was a real issue, as it risked causing a mutiny. Take Francis Lanyon, for example. Lanyon was a Royal Navy sailor who failed to return from a period of leave on time. As a result, he was sentenced to 3 runs through a gauntlet. And if you think that sounds a little harsh, you're not alone. His fellow sailors thought so too. And so Lanyon ran the gauntlet, and no one struck out. Then he ran it again, and no one struck out again. After running it a 3rd time, his crimes were considered to be paid, and he rejoined the ranks with no injury to his person. The commanding officer, realising he was dangerously close to having a rebellion on his hands, decided to leave it at that. This is probably why running the gauntlet was outlawed in the Royal Navy in 1806. Prussia and other German militaries kept up the practice for a few more years, and Russia did too, but running the gauntlet as any kind of official practice died within the 19th century. But while it may have died out as an official practice, running the gauntlet still took place long into the 1900s. In fact, these unofficial gauntlets tended to be a lot more brutal and often fatal. Ronda in Spain is a striking location. The Andalusian city sits upon a cliff top with a sheer drop falling almost 390 feet to the Guadalquivir River below. This city and its landscape certainly left an impression on the writer Ernest Hemingway, who wrote glowingly about Ronda in his book Death in the Afternoon in 1932. Several years later, Ronda was the scene of a massacre at the outset of the Spanish Civil War when Republican supporters targeted those associated with the nationalist movement and hurled them off the cliffs to their death. Hemingway doesn't mention Ronda by name, but he does describe a similar incident and a similar location in his 1941 novel For Whom the Bell Tolls. One of the novel's characters, Pilar, describes how she and her husband, Pablo, took part in an uprising in which nationalists were driven from the cliff edge. In the novel, Pablo arranges his men into 2 lines. They were armed with flails, such as are used to beat out the grain. Those who did not have flails had heavy herdsmen's clubs or ox goads, and some had wooden pitchforks. Some had sickles and reaping hooks, but these Pablo placed at the far end, where the lines reached the end of the cliff. Through this channel, the nationalist supporters of the town were herded, they were beaten, slashed, clubbed, and cut, and then they were flung to their deaths from the cliffs. This is, of course, a fictionalised account of what took place at Ronda, and historians do disagree over whether nationalists were actually driven through a gauntlet before they fell to their deaths. But the fact that Hemingway used it as a literary device underlines the symbolic and humiliating potency of this kind of treatment. And a place where running the gauntlet certainly was used was in communist Poland. Here, enemies of the state were punished and humiliated on the ścieżka zdrowia, meaning health path, or fitness trial. This happened to Waldemar Michalski after he was arrested following the protests of June 1976. To quote, "On the first day I walked the path of health on the way from a truck to the police van about 50 metres. They ordered me to walk slowly so that each one could hit me. They beat me with fists, clubs, boots. At the very end I fell down. I couldn't get up again, under the hail of clubs." More recently, though, the punishment aspect of the gauntlet has fallen away altogether, and instead it's used as a type of initiation ritual. It still takes place in sport teams, military units, academic institutions, or in any other body that is supposed to have a sense of camaraderie and kinship. What was once a punishment has become a rite of passage for joining an exclusive club. These initiations are supposed to be fairly jovial affairs, and they're not supposed to inflict any real pain or suffering. But the problem with adopting a hundreds of years old punishment as an initiation ritual is that some aspects of the punishment remain unchanged. In other words, the practice is still going to be extremely humiliating, and it's still going to be open to some pretty serious abuse. In 1989, the California Maritime Academy held its traditional line crossing ceremony, which basically means people crossing the equator for the first time must undergo an ordeal to mark their passage. For the 1989 ceremony, line crossing newbies were told to crawl around 12 metres through a gauntlet made up of more experienced academy members. These elder sailors whipped the rear ends of these newbies with lengths of rubber hose that gave them quite the walloping. The ceremony was supposed to be voluntary, although many reported feeling pressured into taking part. In particular, many of the female recruits said they'd been coerced into taking part, adding a disturbing dimension to the whole thing. In 1991, another troubling report told how inexperienced recruits at a US Navy and Marine Corps convention in Las Vegas were forced to run a gauntlet through a hotel corridor. The gauntlet runners were all female, and they were all fondled as they passed. Over the weekend-long convention, at least 90 people were subject to what YouTube only lets me call SA. The gauntlet wasn't being used to kill or maim, but it was being used to facilitate humiliating abuse. But while this seems like a relatively recent development in the evolution of the gauntlet, controversies over its usage in hazing or initiation are in fact nothing new. And this brings us to our final story for today, the sad tale of Edward Turnback. Edward was only a teenager when he was enrolled in a new school in Hazleton, Pennsylvania in September 1885. As was customary in Hazleton, the newcomer was told that he must run the gauntlet in order to be accepted. As you might expect, this meant his classmates lined up in 2 rows and took shots at a terrified Turnback as he ran between them. Perhaps Turnback doubled over in fear of the blows, so his lower back took the brunt of the punishment. Or maybe it was just an unlucky strike, delivered with just too much enthusiasm in exactly the wrong place. Whatever it was, Turnback was severely injured by his ordeal. His kidneys suffered massive damage, and he quickly fell ill. He never recovered. What was supposed to be an initiation into a new class ended with the death of a young boy. So, to answer the question that started this whole video, is the gauntlet a form of capital punishment, corporal punishment, or a rite of passage? The answer depends largely on the situation. But in poor Edward Turnback's case, it was all 3.